If you opened up the score and picked a random measure, it'd be really interesting and really, really cool looking, really interesting looking. But so many of those pieces, like you listen to the whole thing, and I would have such a hard time remembering anything about them. Enough to get me to stop and think about why are we spending so much time on these pieces if a listener can't really hold on to anything?
Let's get right to business here, actually, with you, because you're writing all this orchestral music, which I'm in the same boat too. But you actually had an album coming out,
Yes.
an entire album.
Yeah.
So I want to get straight into that. So let's listen to a couple minutes from Obliviana.
That'd be great.
This is going to be about 6 or so minutes into the piece. The whole piece is like 10 minutes long.
10
So
minutes,
I want to go straight into it. So let's listen to it. I'm just curious because I'm an orchestral composer. A lot of people listening to this want to write orchestral music. How do you get from the process of writing these? These are going to be 3 orchestral pieces, right, on this album?
Yes, yeah.
So what's the leap from writing the orchestral piece, like this piece, Obliviana, to like, all right, I'm going to actually record it on an album?
Sure. Well, the album, it's named after the viola concerto, The Horizons. I think it represents almost a decade of creativity. Like the bass piece, which is Rest and Restless, which turned into Rest and Restless, was written in 2015. So like almost 10 years from the genesis to making it. And all 3 pieces, none of these pieces were written, for the album. They were written for commissions. And so it was really a process of writing those pieces, getting them played multiple times, or at least premiering them. I think Rest and Restless has multiple performances, and the viola concerto has only been played once though. But it was, in that 10-year span, just refining the pieces, collecting collaborators, people you want to work with. I met the viola soloist, Brett, from a performance of Rest and Restless. And so making the album kind of came into focus after the 2022 premiere of the concerto, in that I was really happy with that concerto piece. Brett was too. We started talking about we need to do a commercial recording. And you and I have talked before about how for composers, commercial recordings, albums are not necessarily everybody's goal. For me, I am a huge record nut. Music, I listen to records in the car whenever I'm doing anything that doesn't require my complete attention. I usually am listening to music in the back. I've been like that way since middle school. So to me, making an actual album was something that was that feels really important, to get the pieces with a great ensemble, get those recordings on tape, get it set up with a label that can kind of be a steward of those recordings, and then just instead of sending people to my website where they have to kind of find their way to the pieces, they can just hit a link and be taken to either a streaming service or Amazon or someplace like that. And the BBC Scottish Symphony, along with Brett and our conductor Andrew Constantine, and a nice piece of artwork with it. And even though the genesis of kind of going from, okay, I have pieces, to, okay, we're actually going to make an album was Brett wanting to record the viola concerto. I think the other two pieces fit nicely as compendiums to that piece, because you do get a kind of a through line. Although on album order, it's in backwards order chronologically, but the pieces do work as kind of like a main event piece, the concerto, which is almost a half hour long, and then the kind of B-sides, slightly weirder pieces after that. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think it's so rare to see a composer, especially like around our age, like in our 30s, like, I don't know anyone really. I can't even think, maybe with less than one hand, that maybe even less than that, that have come out with orchestral, like purely, I mean, this is a mostly orchestral album.
Yeah, it's an orchestral album. We do have Brett playing a solo viola piece as sort of a encore to the concerto, and that piece, it's called Soliloquy, and it was written, Brett and I had gotten together, we connected online and in person. We were talking about a concerto, and then the COVID lockdowns hit. And so I ended up writing a solo piece for him just in the interim. And that's kind of become, we'll have that be sort of this encore little moment between the concerto and the other two purely orchestral pieces.
Yeah, no, continue. I mean, I was just thinking in my head, like, between the last time, because you were on the show like a year ago or so, and we were just kind of talking about whatever.
We talked about whatever.
It was an interesting conversation, but I realized after we had that conversation, we probably should have been talking about your music too, and how and the kind of trajectory of that, because you and I have been on a kind of similar path since. God, maybe like at least for 10 years. No,
Yeah.
I mean, we've been on almost the same orchestral circuits. A couple of them were exactly the same at the same time. Some of them were the same, but at different times.
At different years, yeah.
I mean, this is I think this is going to be an interesting conversation for people out there that are just maybe 10 years behind, or even people that are farther along and want to know, like, what's the next generation looking like?
Yeah.
Because we have a strange insight to all of this as people that are working orchestral composers that didn't just win one random contest, because there are some that just win one and then they kind of do other things, or the orchestra is not their thing. But we have, a knock on wood, we were lucky enough and also worked really hard enough to get a lot of orchestral opportunities in a relatively short time. And I think 5 to 10 years, like 10 years, let's say, that's a relatively short time. I mean, this album that you put out, then my question is, do you feel like this is kind of the culmination of those 10 years of work? Because I know there's the other pieces you've written before this, before these three pieces that I'm aware of, that I've been a part of too, like at the premieres and things.
Yeah.
And I can definitely, at least in my ears, I hear things in those pieces you were working out that are so mature in these three pieces, and this first piece that we heard, of course, Obliviana.
Yeah, it's interesting because I respond well to sort of the call for scores type of opportunities, and those have led to a lot of orchestral performances. But I still feel like I'm building my career as a composer in terms of convincing other orchestras to play my music beyond the call for scores, the contest circuit. And obviously I also do a little bit of film music as well. I teach. And so again, instead of just having having an orchestral performance, posting about it online on social media, and then just having the piece sit on my website, or who knows who's going to find it, just, it was really important to me to at least make some sort of, it felt like the right time, and I had the right people to make an album, if anything else, for posterity, just to get those pieces in a realm where I can just immediately point people to and they'll hear great recordings. The piece you were referring to that we were on the same concerts of, that would have been Even in Paradise. And you're right, when I look back on that piece, it's not a bad piece, but there's definitely like, I was much more focused on moment to moment things, trying out crazy ideas in that way, as opposed to looking at, I think Obliviana and the other two pieces, I feel like I'm much more comfortable thinking about music in not just in those measure by measure, what kind of cool orchestration detail can I do here, but like in the big picture mode. So what we just listened to in Obliviana, yes, there's all sorts of wacky things happening, but you can also kind of boil down what's happening to like a very short description. Like I think that clicking march sound with the glockenspiels, that's like something that really hits you, that I hope really hits audiences, is something that they can hold on to despite all the other notes going on at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, and that texture too, like especially when you look at the score, it's such a simple texture,
right?
But the sound of it is so striking, and it sounds so individual. It doesn't sound like anything I've quite heard before.
Yeah,
and I think it's that percussive sound is just, what is it? It's bass drum, and the other two I forget what they are, but you're hitting.
So yeah,
all of
what
them
I
on
asked
the rim,
for
right?
in the score, it's rim of the bass drum, I think rim of the snare drum, and a ruta. So, and that can be played on any hard surface. I was in the control booth when we made the album, so I didn't quite have the vantage point to see everything happening. And when you record these things, it's very fast. So if you hear the sound you want, you're kind of like, okay, I don't need to stop everything to see how they're getting it. But that's what the score calls for, is two drum rims and the collection of sticks, the Mahler ruta. And this kind of focusing on the big picture was something that kind of came into my mind as a composer really during grad school, where I was hearing a lot of orchestral music, a lot of new music in Los Angeles, and too many pieces where I got this feeling like if you opened up the score and picked a random measure, there'd be nothing, it'd be really interesting and really, really cool looking, really interesting looking. Obviously, whoever this is knows how to be creative in this medium, but so many of those pieces, like you listen to the whole thing, and I would have such a hard time remembering anything about them. Not every piece, obviously, but enough to get me to stop and think about what is it, why are we spending so much time on these pieces if a listener can't really hold on to anything?
And it doesn't have to be. People think, I feel like when this is code for, it needs to have a tune or something like this. But
it's not that.
That's
It's
not
really not that. And
yeah.
this is something I stress basically to everybody, including not just my students, but anybody who will listen to me about this, is that it's not a stylistic thing at all. To me, it's a craft thing. If you've got, as you mentioned, if on one end of the spectrum you've got a catchy tune, on the other end of the spectrum you could have the entire orchestra smashing their instruments on the stage. It'd be equally as memorable.
That's a good way to put it.
And within that, there's all sorts of choices one can make to try and say, hey, this is a fully formed musical idea, even if it's something as simple as glockenspiel plus snare drum, right? Because the tune in Obliviana, when that comes in, is not a catchy tune. It jumps up and down, but it has a I tried to give it a straightforward feeling. That and this consistent color to me was something that might work in that. And so going back to when I mentioned being in LA, being a student, hearing a lot of music that was interesting moment to moment, but completely forgettable in the whole, that kind of forced me to start looking at more closely at other genres of music, because I've been listening to classical and film music and video game music for a very long time. It was kind of what I was naturally drawn to. But looking at stuff like rock and roll, like prog rock, like electronica, and asking the question, how is it that these artists, you turn on their music and within 2 seconds you immediately know what the music is about? You may not necessarily what the song's about, but like what the musical ideas are about, and there's just an instant clarity. And so trying to integrate that sense of immediacy and clarity into what I do on the classical side, and now also on the film side as well.
Yeah, it's not as simple as saying, I'm going to use like a very clear melodic idea and a clear harmonic idea, which is what my sense is from most people. That's what they think that they want to.
Yeah, I really don't like.
Hear,
I really don't like the kind of oversimplified conversations of like texture music versus melodies, or in the film music world, sound design versus themes.
Right. It's not that clear and simple.
It's not that simple. It's I also think it's really cool when composers, one way to do it is to obscure your ideas, is to give us that kind of detail-based writing for a time, and then have that arrive at some sort of meaningful place that it does have that clarity. That's something you can do in music that I think is also another option, is you can mix all these techniques and create a big picture sense. Maybe not from, if you don't want to just have a super clear, memorable texture at first, you can also have that emerge from the process. And it's a temporal, so like you obscure things for the audience and then bring them into focus. That's also a technique you can use.
Well, you do a technique kind of like that in the next excerpt I want to show, where you have this melody that kind of starts to emerge out of thin air, and it's really beautiful. But it's not like, all right, I'm going to play melody with harmony. I mean, it's got a lot of stuff going on underneath the surface, but you, as the composer, crafted in such a way where it's like, well, I want to make sure the listener is paying attention to that English horn solo. So that's what we're going to hear right now. This is going to be Rest and Restless. This is like 3 minutes into the piece of a bigger 15-minute piece. So here we go. Or before, we were talking about like this idea of like revealing something over time. And also I really like this idea of not just presenting a melody, but also, you augment parts of it, you subtract parts of it, you go up and down, and you're able to extend this thing. Like, I think this excerpt, this whole melody goes like 2 minutes, Yeah,
and
2 to
3 minutes. Yeah.
Most melodies don't last that long. They last like 8 bars, 16 bars, and it's kind of done. But you're able to push it further in this little excerpt here.
Yeah, it's in the original double bass version, the idea was it's going to be this tune that's going to have this really, hopefully, this opening motive hook thing that people, but I'm going to keep adding a note to it after starting the third time. I start adding notes to it, but always starting with those same three, that same gesture. And that to me is an interesting technique for a sort of alternate way of thematic writing, where you start your tune the same way every time, but it goes in different directions, or you add to it. That can have interesting results without resorting to either just here's the theme, now I'm doing something else, now here's the theme again, or here's the theme in major, here's the theme in minor, here's the theme, augment, that sort of thing. It's and when you combine it, since it was the original was a double bass version, I just had a double stop, or I had the melody playing against an open string. That was about all the accompaniment I could get out.
And by the
of
way,
that.
when you say that the original was a
Yes.
double, I want to stress that this huge orchestral piece came from a solo double bass
Yes, it
piece
did.
called, and with the same title.
Same
right?
title, yeah.
Rest and Rest, the same thing. So you can even write an orchestral work out of like literally
Yeah.
almost zero material. Right?
And I think
One
that
player.
was because what happened was starting with Even in Paradise and moving forward, I really challenged myself to write some sort of orchestral piece once a year for practice and also to have something to submit to things. And I think Restless, the orchestra version, I think that was my project in that realm for 2016. And I think it was really good that I did that around the same time that I was starting to have these ideas of clarity and big picture versus details, and how it's, if you don't pay attention to the big picture, are you even going to make something that people are going to take something home with them in their memory and their minds? Because I was working just with this piece I wrote for double bass, which at its most complex has, fast string rocking. It's got some harmonics, but it doesn't have nearly the amount of detail that you would get if I was orchestrating a string quartet or a piano piece. So it really forced me to bring those main ideas out and to have all the orchestral detail ideas really be in the background. And I think that was a very good exercise for me in terms of learning how to write with, okay, here's what I want the audience to hear. I'm going to put that as far in the foreground as I can. And everything else that's going to support that, but not necessarily be what the audience is supposed to be paying attention to, I'm going to arrange that either by using range or type of technique or dynamics or whatever, to have that, to really put that into a supporting role and not be too concerned if the listener picks up on it as much as the foreground.
Yeah, I remember like being in school, there would be, I forgot which teacher said this, or maybe I heard this somewhere, but there's this difference between writing something where there's writing it to write it because you need to have some kind of harmony or some kind of texture, or writing it to feel it. Like it's just there for feeling.
Yeah.
And if you took that part out, you wouldn't know, but you would feel something different. It's hard to put a finger on it, but I feel like a lot of this piece is that.
Right. And that was something that back in Even in Paradise was something retroactive that I realized what I was doing was I was putting too much into the piece because I didn't realize the main idea. I would hear it because I wrote it and I knew what to listen for. But the feedback of hearing an actual orchestra play it and having an audience sitting next to me gives you that realization when, oh, that thing I wanted to hear and I know to listen for, it's not clear enough for everyone else. It's it's there, but it's buried underneath my detail ideas a little bit.
I think this point you just made is the reason why composers take so long to develop versus like an athlete. So hear me out, what I mean by this. So like, if you're someone playing tennis, right, and you have a coach, or let's say like that would be your feedback, right? You have someone, you hit the thing and then you hit it 1,000 times and he's telling you, oh, the angle is just a little off or the speed is a little off, right? For us composers, we kind of sort of have that with teachers. Yeah. That like on one-on-one or a group format, but still in those scenarios, you're getting like kind of half the story in terms of the feedback. You don't really get the feedback until you're with an audience. Yeah. Whether that audience be like a subscription orchestra audience, which is a general audience, or even whether that feedback be in an academic setting with your peers. Like you don't, and that doesn't happen that often.
And it takes time to develop a feeling for, is it something in my orchestration that's not working, or is it the ensemble that just isn't playing it quite there yet? Yeah. That sense of, developing a sense of, is this something I'm doing versus is this something that the player is doing, and we're in rehearsals and they may just not have it yet. That takes time to develop a sense of as well.
Yeah, there's so many other factors besides just what you can control. Yeah.
And once you realize that that's also happening, that then goes back into your orchestration to try and clear things up even more.
Yeah, it's really complex, and I feel like it's more complex than most realize. Because like I was at like last week I was with the symphony in Northern California doing my Mishwar piece, and it was kind of funny to kind of in my way explain to especially the patrons that I never did this before, but I would tell them because I could sense that they just really had no clue what it was like to be a composer. Maybe they know what it's like to be a pianist, solo pianist or solo violinist because they've seen them come around and play the Sibelius Concerto or whatever. Like they've seen that many times, right? But they don't know about a composer. So I would tell them, this piece, 4-minute piece, took me 100 hours to write.
Wow.
And they would be like, really? How? Like, why does it take so long? I'm like, well, I have to do this, then I have to do this. And then their brain starts to change in terms of like how they perceive my work. Yeah. It's not the work of a genius person that just sat there and wrote it in an afternoon, which is what I think the perception is. It's like what you're describing. You write the thing out, you go to the orchestra, you get feedback, you get feedback from the audience, you get feedback from the players. Yeah. You take it or you leave it. You get feedback from the, from your teacher. Like it's all of this stuff, and that contributes to the piece as well.
It's not just orchestra patrons, but also, I've also run into, musicians who are also surprised that it takes a long time to sometimes write a piece. I just did a project earlier this year where the turnaround time was rather fast. It was a unique opportunity that I think myself and the other composers involved, we felt, even though the turnaround time was not ideal, the opportunity itself and the ensemble was unique enough that we really wanted to do something with them. And I think it is occasionally a good thing for composers to have to churn out something quickly. It is nice to exercise that skill every once in a while, but there is a sort of, dissatisfaction in having to turn in something so quickly. And I remember one of my teachers from forever ago saying that, you might need to get to a third or fourth performance of a piece or a third or fourth version and plus performance of a piece before a piece to really truly be finished or for you to feel satisfied.
Oh, I agree with that. 10,000%.
I wrote that piece for that group. It was, wrote it very fast. It did feel good to exercise that skill of, I don't know, I don't keep track of how many hours it takes to write a piece, but it was a 10-minute piece for like 20-something parts and written in probably a net time of 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh yeah, there was no way you would have hit anywhere near 100 hours.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. So I do think composers, it's good to have that skill because sometimes you will be called on to write that quickly. After that performance, I did go to the leadership and because this was the first time they had done anything like a composition, sort of a new music concert with their ensemble, and I did tell them, like, hey, if you get your composers involved and on board sooner, it will help them not quite crash into the finish line. So that was my recent experience, right, having to write something really quickly. And as we were talking about upstairs before we started filming, my idea to orchestrate Rest and Restless from the double bass version was inspired by your orchestration of the Come On Fantasy. And that challenge I gave myself of one orchestra piece per year, I didn't give myself any rules as to what the orchestra piece had to be, how long it had to be, or where it had to come from. So writing an orchestra piece from scratch, a 10-minute orchestra piece from scratch, at least for me, is always averaged between the 4-month, 5-month, 6-month period. Again, I keep track of days more so than hours, but I didn't want to spend that amount of time each year on an orchestra piece. So the idea to orchestrate something that was already laid out and do an almost 1-to-1 orchestration was just a way to, it was a time-saving exercise as much as anything else. And so yeah, that to me, that's, for anybody who's interested in writing orchestra music, it does not have to be from scratch. It can be something you've already planted elsewhere in your creative life that you can turn into an orchestral project.
I also even go as far to say is that if you haven't written a reasonable chamber piece or solo piece, you have no business writing an orchestra piece.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because all the problems that happen in an orchestra piece, they're going to happen in chamber music. It's just going to be amplified.
Yeah.
When you make a mistake in the orchestra world, you could have possibly, first of all, there are going to be many mistakes that you do. Even if you're a seasoned person, right? You're going to make mistakes. But if you get rid of those mistakes while you're writing the chamber stuff, you can at least tamper down the number of things that can go wrong when you go to orchestra. And that's my mindset. And that's, I mean, that's why I arrange a lot of my music for orchestra. It's like, okay, that piece was good for string quartet.
Right.
Can it work for an orchestra? Maybe it can, maybe it doesn't. But I think it's worth the effort.
Yeah, it is, excellent to focus on, because in some ways there are certain things about writing chamber music that I find much more difficult than writing orchestra music. Orchestra, you got all these colors to play with. You have all these effects you can do. You got all the percussion. Whereas with chamber music, you got to create something interesting with far less choices. So focusing on chamber music, what orchestra music adds in terms of difficulty is the grind work, is the workload, is the formatting, is the organization of all the ideas. But in terms of the actual musical choices you can make, I think orchestra can be easier on the creative process. So working in chamber music, you might be working on something that creatively is more difficult, but you're focusing your energies on the creative challenge and not the the score formatting, not the
or even the organization of where the ideas go, or like
Right.
keeping track. Oh, it was in the trombones here. I got to make sure to slide it to the horns.
Yeah,
over
so
here.
that's a great observation of why I think people who want to write for orchestra music should at least be concurrently, if not writing chamber music beforehand.
Yeah.
I definitely didn't start out writing chamber music when I started. I started really just like, hey, I'm hearing orchestra at the symphony. I'm hearing orchestra in the movies. I'm going to write for orchestra.
I was like that too.
Yeah.
I was like that too. Yeah,
And
of course.
And that's definitely not the wrong place to start. And I try and be very empathetic to students when they come to me about what they want to work on, because I want them to be interested in what they're working on. But occasionally, you'll get somebody who wants to write an orchestra piece and they just don't know what to do. They don't know how to start it. And the question will occasionally, I'll ask the question is like, should you be writing an orchestra piece right now? I think, you're having trouble. Why not start with the chamber piece, or start with something where the musical ideas, not so much the orchestration, but the notes, the rhythms, harmonies, etc., are going to be easier for you to deal with.
Yeah, like figure out a way to connect your synapses first before like moving on to like such a grand project like that. Because I feel like, even now I'm like still discovering new tools, all the time. I'm like discovering new, because I mean, mainly I've been doing it with my microtonal language, but lately I've been figuring out, okay, I kind of have my microtonal language not figured out, but I like where I'm at. Well, what about my rhythm? My rhythm is lacking, right? Or my form is maybe a little too formulaic.
Yeah.
Like, how can I push it? And I just feel like, especially when I deal with students, there's not that focused. There's not that not that I'm getting on my. I remember John Adams had this thing, which I think was taken out of context. I don't know if you remember, in the New York Times, like 10 years ago or so, maybe it was longer. He was saying, how he thought young composers were not disciplined enough or something. I don't remember what the exact line was, but whatever he said was taken out of context. Okay, because he's a huge supporter of young composers.
Right.
But I kind of am feeling a little bit like this.
And
lately.
I feel like I should also say that we're talking about chamber music because that's kind of what we're drawn to. But I think experience. There are plenty of people who have proven themselves completely adept at the orchestra who came from genres other than classical. People who either were in rock bands or jazz, and that's kind of the same thing where you're not dealing with this enormous color palette, or at least unless you're like, into the synth world or anything like that. But something where the basic musical choices are more to this are going to be what you're forced to deal with first and foremost, as opposed to the orchestra where you have so many choices where you get swept up in the details and in the how cool it sounds to do all these different, combinations. But maybe you miss either the big picture stuff or the core musical ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of your this next excerpt I want to play from your viola concerto, The Horizons, because you have this like very, very simple, I mean, it's literally quarter notes. Okay. The viola part. I mean, it's the most at least this part. There's plenty of parts in that piece that are very virtuosic, but this part in particular is the part I was probably most drawn to because it was such a simple quarter note, 4/4 melody, but then it gets just like taken over by the orchestra in such a profound way. I want to play a couple minutes of this. I mean, this is like a perfect example of saying like, hey, look, I got a big orchestra, right? But I'm not going to throw everything at it. I'm going to actually do the opposite. I'm going to have the simplest thing I could possibly think of and make it my own.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that's so difficult to do if you haven't written a bunch of orchestra pieces or even just music in general that you feel attached to. Like to have that kind of confidence to say, hey, I'm gonna just do this and it's gonna be enough. It's gonna be fine.
Yeah, I think that sense comes from a variety of places. One is older orchestral music, where things are not necessarily more straightforward in every aspect, but there was not nearly as much interest in this sort of clever pyrotechnics that kind of developed over the last century and a half. And composers should keep in their toolbox the idea that the different orchestral families are families. They work together really well, and that style of orchestration is totally, can still be extremely effective. So from older orchestral music, good film music, I think also operates on similar principles. And so I was very inspired by that. But that quarter note idea, that I remember, because the piece starts with that quarter note idea in the flutes. And then the excerpt we heard is the payoff at the end of the movement for that. And I remember trying to start the piece, in my studio with my piano. I write nearly all the time when I compose. I'll have Logic open with a piano patch and a full generic string patch, because I like to hear sustained chords for a while. It helps me figure out thick harmonies better than a piano does. Manuscript paper and finale, and that's about it. Yeah, I remember trying to start the piece and just getting nowhere, coming up with not coming up with no ideas, but just coming up with ideas that were okay. Like, I don't know if you have that experience of like, you come up with an idea and it's like, yeah, that could be a piece, but do I really want to spend the time with that idea to make it a piece? And the answer is almost always no. So you try and move on to a different idea. And yeah, I remember that quarter note idea, that happened after like 2 or 3 days of coming up with okay ideas, could be a piece ideas, and just getting to the point where I was like, all right, I'm just going to go outside. I'm going to go out on my balcony and just think about what I want to do. And when you're by yourself, you have what I call just your primal music making tools, your voice, and your ability to make rhythm with your body. That's it. And your imagination, of course. And when you take the other tools away, the studio tools away, the piano tools away, sometimes you get an even more direct sense of clarity. And yeah, after, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes of walking around out on the balcony outside, just this tune in low flutes kind of popped in my head, and through singing out loud to myself quietly outside. That's where that coordinate came from. It came from a temporary giving up of all the fancy tools, and just what can I make just with my, the primal tools of just my body. And then once I had that, I was like, yeah, that's it.
I mean, that's a really great way to put it. And the other thing I like about what you said is that, you didn't say, hey, I have to come up with an entire soundscape in my head. Like, you didn't put that pressure on yourself. You said, no, I'm just going to come up with this one idea. And
I just needed to start the piece. I needed just something to start the piece with at that point.
Right. But that's my sense, like, from, just because, sometimes I get into, these moments, like right now, that's how I feel, because I just came from a premiere, is that there is what I think the piece is, or what I think the experiences of the piece is, and because I talk to so many composers, I have a feeling of what the zeitgeist is. But then I see what the outside, let's call it the public or the outside world thinks. I say that's really not; those two things are not matching, and it has nothing to do with the experience of the piece itself. Really, it's more about like how the sausage is made, kind of thing. And it's really it really is a trial and error thing, and it's really a time intensive thing.
Yeah, the debate on composer versus audience, kind of always pops up periodically. It's all a balancing act.
Yeah.
And I think the better you know whom you're writing for, the more options you will have in terms of solving the puzzle of what do I want to write versus who am I writing for.
Right.
In that experience of trying to start that piece, I knew the soloist, I knew who the conductor was, and I knew the audience. The viola concerto was written for my hometown orchestra,
The Fort Wayne Philharmonic.
Fort Wayne Phil. And so I had a general sense of what kind of new music that audience is exposed to, which was not that much. And instead of having this internal debate or internal crisis about what to do, to me, I just treat it as a puzzle. It's like, how do I create something that's going to excite me as a composer that is also going to hopefully work for this situation of this commission? And I'm happy. I mean, everything in the viola concerto I stand behind 100%. Like, there's nothing in that piece that I feel was a compromise or anything. Like, everything in that piece is definitely me. Everything on the album is definitely me. But it would not be, I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't thinking about the audience at all, because I was. But instead of this automatically antagonistic relationship, to me, I treat it like a puzzle. It's like, here's the pieces I have. I know what I care about as a composer. How do I go about creating something that's going to balance what I want and what the people who are paying me and commissioning me are expecting?
Yeah.
And it's going to be different on every project, every commission project, every film project, the expectations of you, what you want to do and what the clients want. But it doesn't have to be this misery causing.
But this
battle.
is kind of how I actually increasingly I'm thinking the same way you are. And it was kind of recent, probably the last 3-4 years, maybe not even 4, maybe 3 years, where I've been thinking like this, like it's a puzzle. And the audience is part of that puzzle too. And well, for me, the musicians are not as much. I mean, I try to make them as part of the puzzle, but there's only so much you can do, especially when you're working with my language, to get them involved, because some people are receptive, some are not as receptive. But this thing about the audience, I think, is really important, because there could be an audience like the Fort Wayne audience, Fort Wayne Philharmonic. That's a different audience than the New York Philharmonic audience. That's a different audience from, International Contemporary Ensemble audience. That's a different audience than, the, where we went to USC, like the USC Edge New Music Concert audiences. Those are all different audiences.
And it's not that I'm saying you necessarily need to satisfy that audience, but it should be a parameter you're considering.
Right.
So if you want to do something challenging, you'll know that you're going to challenge them. And that might have an impact on how the shape of the piece goes. My conductor, Andrew Constantine, has programmed Obliviana on next year's Fort Wayne Phil program, and I'm a little surprised. Not because because I know he likes the piece, but I think it might be the weirdest thing that the Fort Wayne Phil audience has heard in a long time, and I have no idea what the reception is going to be.
Yeah, but if they like, but this is the other thing. I have a lot of analogies today.
Great.
If they were receptive to your viola concerto, right? Yeah. Which I'm sure they were. What happens is that when you come back, right?
Yeah.
And they see your name, and if you're there, are you going to be there in person?
I certainly hope so. Yeah.
Okay, so when you come back, it's like when you go to see a comedian, like I went to see Bill Burr. I always get those two. I went to see Bill Burr, at Madison Square Garden a few months ago, and I follow him anyway. I love the stuff, so like it's almost like anything he would have said there, I would have liked. I mean, obviously he had to perform and do. He can't just stand there and do nothing, right? I mean, but like whatever new material he had, which he had new material, I was most likely going to I already came in with the mindset that I'm probably going to like this. So that optimistic attitude that people are going to have because they're about to hear your music again, that works in your favor. So then you can challenge them a little bit with a piece like Obliviana.
Sure.
There's a little, it's not like that far out from the concerto, but it's a little bit more.
Yeah, it goes to a darker place at the end for sure. But they already are kind of primed for you, and they already. And no, I think it'll be fine.
Whereas if it was the other way around, maybe it wouldn't work as well.
I was just about to say, Obliviana was written for the New York Youth Symphony. If the Fort Wayne Phil had commissioned a 10-minute orchestra piece with the same instrumentation, I don't know if I would have written Obliviana.
Right.
It may have been a different piece.
Yeah.
But that's just how it goes. And yeah, so I'm interested to see how I think it'll go well. I was initially surprised that Andrew programmed it. So, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. Let's see. That's the hope, that we're
Yeah.
trying to challenge audiences a little bit, one step at a
Oh
time.
yeah,
You know?
my dad has sent out to me on multiple occasions that, you know, he's biased, of course, but what he's told me is that, Patrick, I like how you challenge us and then reward us as
That's
listeners.
a good way to put it. Yeah.
And so that's might be something that composers listening to this might think about as, ooh, that sounds like an interesting thing I want to pursue, or not, but it is something you can try.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a great way to put it. I mean, I think about this all the time. But at some point, I kind of have to also not think about it, because then I just I get into this rabbit hole.
It is very possible, and I do see it on occasion, of composers getting trapped inside their own brains, and it really just becomes unproductive.
Yeah.
No matter how philosophical your thoughts may be, if you're not getting something done, you just you know, what's the point? You got to just get to work.
Yeah, I see this happening a lot in academia, especially during my mostly during my doctorate. I have to say.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Although it was an amazing program at Columbia, but it does get kind of philosophical in terms of the discussion, and sometimes we don't hear music for a while. I'm like, are we going to hear some music?
Yeah, I don't even know if philosophy is really the right word for it at some points.
Right.
It's that bad, but...
Right. So what are you working on next? What's going to be the big thing? So the album, I think this show is going to come out once the album is out. So we'll have all the links down in the description below. So people got this far in the show, then you should listen. Just go. It's
please do.
Like you said earlier, it's just one click away, so they can do that. But is there more orchestra stuff down the dock? What can we know?
Yeah, this summer. So this is summer of 2024. It's funny because you started the show saying, Patrick, you're such an orchestra guy. I agree with that. And to the extent that I've been neglecting chamber music for like a year and a half. So this summer is kind of a chamber music summer for me. I'm currently working on a percussion solo piece. I have to write an English horn and piano sonata type piece. I'm going to be working the Acropolis Quintet at their institute, which is in Petoskey, Michigan, which is like 20 minutes away from where I live.
Acropolis Quintet is mostly
it's a reed
instrument.
It's a reed quintet, not a wind quintet. I have a friend who wants a saxophone piano sonata type piece. I've got an idea for a flute, clarinet, and piano trio that I want to do. So yeah, a lot. I'm trying to hit like a piece a month for the summer and maybe slightly into the fall. There may be some new things on the frontier of that video game show I used to do, Journey Live, with Austin Wintory. That show might get resurrected, and in which case I might be involved with that. And
which is a whole nother side of you we haven't talked about.
That's fine. I
wanted to make sure we get to your
that job got
classical stuff.
I only was involved with that arrangement job was from 2016, and I really just served as the backup conductor since then. But there may be a different configuration in the works. I'm not sure for certain yet. And then, I scored my first feature film last year. Hope to do more film scoring going forward. I'm in conversations about a wind band commission, in conversations about a cello concerto. So on the orchestra side, very much in between projects, but focusing on lots of chamber music in my lap. So
awesome. Well, check out Patrick's stuff down below.
Yes,
you better. I'm gonna know if you don't. And thanks, man.
Saad has told me how much I've seen Saad check his analytics in real time. He checks them often. So
I do know. All right, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much.